Prime Minister Mark Carney is heading to the NATO summit in Turkey this week. Tensions are rising among allies there. So tell me, what is at stake for Canada at this meeting?
Well, I think it's legitimacy for NATO as an organization, including Canada. The focus, as stated on the NATO website, is investment, obviously, increased investment, increased industrial capacity, which you can read into as more independent ability to create military equipment.
Well, I think for Canada, it's can Carney make Canada credible as a military power? And I think it's the same thing for all of NATO. This is not a summit about spending. It's actually a summit about can we produce the weapons.
Part of Canada's story at NATO will be told by Ottawa companies like Anvil.
We help modern militaries make sense of the enormous amount of battlefield data that is there.
They help coordinate battlefield data between different forces.
And show the world that Canada is producing kind of consequential, important capabilities which can strengthen the alliance.
Could Donald Trump's anger at European allies over the war in Iran overwhelm everything at next week's NATO meeting? Yes, that's possible. Canadian officials certainly hope that doesn't happen. They have a new story to tell about this country's newfound interest in its military for the first time in a long time.
A quiet decision has put Canada on a new path, and the world is starting to notice. Canada is becoming stronger and more confident, while the United States could be losing some of its influence. And IIT could create a new challenge for the United States. Prime Minister Mark Carney announced that Canada had achieved the NATO 2% of GDP defense spending benchmark, a target Canada had failed to meet for more than a decade. To achieve it, Canada spent more than $63 billion, the largest year-over-year increase to Canada's defense spending in generations, working across over a dozen federal departments and agencies in just 10 months. That foundation is what Carney carried to the NATO summit in Ankara, Turkey on July 7th, 2026. And the commitment Canada made at that summit goes far beyond the 2% benchmark it just achieved. At the 2025 NATO summit in The Hague, Canada and its NATO allies agreed to a new defense investment pledge of investing 5% of annual GDP by 2035. As part of this pledge, Canada will invest 3.5% of GDP in defense spending and 1.5% of GDP in critical defense and security-related investments. Moving from 2% to 3.5% of GDP in core defense spending over 9 years is an enormous commitment. From 2016 to 2026, European allies and Canada spent an additional $1.2 trillion on defense, including a 20% increase of $139 billion between 2024 and 2025. Canada's trajectory within that broader allied buildup is the fastest acceleration in its modern history. The specific context making Canada's Ankara summit appearance more significant than a routine spending pledge is documented in what happened to NATO's most important bilateral relationship in the preceding months. The war in Iran ripped open fissures within the alliance. Key alliance members, notably France, criticized the Trump administration's decision to go to war, and others, particularly Spain, refused to allow the United States to carry out operations from their bases. Several NATO members declined to participate in the American campaign. Canada was among the allied nations that did not join the US military operation. The Ankara summit that followed was, as analysts described it, primarily about managing the United States and keeping Trump committed to the alliance against a backdrop of documented American troop reductions in Europe. The American troop withdrawal dimension provides the strategic context for Canada's defense buildup. The reduction of brigade combat teams in Europe from 4 to 3, the cancellation of a long-haul fires battalion deployment to Germany, the decision not to replace a rotational army brigade in Romania, and the withdrawal of approximately 5,000 US troops from Germany in response to limited Allied support in Iran all underscore the trend. Europe is being asked to carry more of its own defense burden as American force commitments decline. Canada's accelerated spending is a direct response to that transition building. The capability Canada needs to operate independently of American support in a way it has never had to consider since the original Cold War alliance was assembled. More than $3 billion in infrastructure and defense-related investments across Atlantic Canada were announced alongside the NATO achievement. The Atlantic Canada announcement is specifically naval $1.2 billion to modernize critical power and municipal service infrastructure at CFB Halifax Dockyard in Stadacona, $648 million to construct 2 new aviation support facilities at 14 Wing Greenwood supporting the Royal Canadian Air Force's CP-8, a Poseidon fleet, and CQ-9B Guardian with modern hangars. Halifax is the home of Canada's Atlantic Fleet. The Poseidon is a maritime patrol aircraft whose primary mission is tracking submarine activity in the North Atlantic and Arctic, exactly the operational capability that becomes more critical as Russia expands its northern military presence, and as Canada's own submarine replacement decision between Hanwha and TKMS approaches announcement. Canada officially joined the European Union's Security Action for Europe initiative at the Munich Security Conference in February 2026. SAFE is a key pillar of the EU's Readiness 2030 plan, and Canada's participation in SAFE will enhance defense readiness on both sides of the Atlantic. SAFE membership gives Canadian defense firms access to joint European procurement programs and the $150 billion Rearm Europe Fund, making Canada the only non-European country inside that framework. The submarine contract currently deciding between Germany's TKMS and South Korea's Hanwha is expected to be announced before July's NATO summit. Neither bidder is American. Carney's framing of why Canada is spending what it is spending provides the strategic rationale of the spending data supports. The United States is beginning to monetize its hegemony, charging for access to its markets and reducing its relative contributions to our collective security. In parallel, the world's trade routes, allegiances, energy systems, and even intelligence itself are being rewired. Rising great powers are now in strategic competition with America. A new imperialism threatens. Middle powers compete for interests and attention, knowing that if they are not at the table, they will be on the menu. The Saudi Arabia visit that followed the Ankara summit was the second component of the post-NATO diplomatic sequence. The federal government described it as part of a wider strategy to diversify partnerships beyond North America and Europe, covering investment opportunities, energy cooperation, critical minerals, artificial intelligence, and regional security discussions. Saudi Arabia is simultaneously one of the world's largest sovereign wealth fund managers and one of the primary energy market actors whose production decisions affect global oil pricing. Canada's West Coast oil pipeline, targeting Asian and global markets, operates in the same pricing environment that Saudi Aramco's production decisions shape. A Canadian Prime Minister meeting with Saudi leadership in the same week as the NATO summit reflects the integration of energy strategy and security strategy that has characterized Carney's foreign policy since March 2025. In 2025 alone, European allies and Canada increased defense spending by 20% from the previous calendar year, with all allies now exceeding the previous defense spending target of 2% of GDP. For the first time in recorded NATO history, a European ally, Norway, has surpassed the United States in defense spending per capita. The alliance is structurally changing. The United States is reducing its relative share of NATO's capability provision as European and Canadian spending climbs. Canada's 2% achievement, its 5% commitment path, its SAFE membership, its European defense procurement diversification, and its $63 billion spending increase are all components of the same structural transition. A transition from an alliance where American military power was the default backstop to one where each member nation must sustain its own credible contribution. Atlantic Canada plays a critical role in advancing Canada's economic and national security home to nearly 10,000 direct aerospace and defense jobs, representing 20% of Canada's defense industry employment. The contracts flowing from Canada's accelerated procurement submarines, Global Eye aircraft, fighter jets, Arctic radars, Halifax dockyard modernization will define the industrial structure of that workforce for the next generation.